It was a surprisingly quiet Sunday morning when the absence hit me with the force of a blow. The familiar space above the living room fireplace, Eleanor's sacred spot, was jarringly empty. The portrait, which I had painted with deep concentration and trembling hands after her first harrowing chemo session, had been unceremoniously removed. My daughter, Amy, was humming a cheerful, oblivious tune in the kitchen, but the silence from the living room screamed louder than any sudden noise. I had awakened with the usual, profound weight of grief that never truly lifts, but this specific act felt like a fresh, unnecessary cruelty to her memory. When I finally asked Amy where the painting had gone, she hesitated, visibly troubled. She refused to meet my gaze, intensely studying the kitchen floor tiles as if they might provide a simpler answer to this deep disrespect. Finally, she murmured, "Ben thought it made the house feel heavy." My heart stopped cold. After 48 years of a beautiful, committed marriage, my son-in-law had summarily dismissed her beloved face as an obstacle to his comfort. The words felt like a desecration of something truly sacred and personal. I knew then I had to speak to Ben immediately to understand the depth of his callous thoughtlessness. Just before you continue to watch, Joe would like you to subscribe to this channel and like this video. It would encourage him to keep his streak of thrilling revenge stories for you to watch. Alright, back to the story. I found Ben outside, meticulously trimming the hedges as if he were the sole proprietor of the estate, applying a fussy precision that irritated me. The bright morning sun highlighted the sweat on his brow, catching the precise, controlled movements he made to match some sleek, Architectural Digest-style landscaping magazine Amy had recently shown him. He flashed a practiced, polite smile when he saw me, the kind of smile that often conceals an underlying guilt. I walked up to him and directly asked about the location of my wife's portrait, my voice low but firm. His smile instantly faltered, his scissors pausing mid-clip. He offered a non-committal response, saying the portrait was just in the basement for now, because several recent guests had mentioned it looked too sad for a main living area where people relax. His voice was unsettlingly casual, as though he were discussing moving a mundane piece of furniture, not actively attempting to erase Eleanor's presence from our lives together. The outright dismissal stung more sharply than open anger would have. I stood there, remembering how Eleanor had welcomed those very same guests with her warm laughter and homemade pie, making everyone feel utterly cherished and included. Now, her image was discarded like unnecessary junk. I turned without another word, leaving him with his guilt, and headed straight for the basement stairs, determined to see what his vague, "for now" truly meant. The basement air was thick and cold, smelling strongly of mildew and the accumulated residue of old, forgotten memories that had no value to him. I finally located Eleanor's portrait leaned carelessly against a dusty box of tangled holiday lights near the old washing machine. The beautiful canvas was covered in fine dust and delicate cobwebs that stretched across her painted face like unsettling scars or deep cracks in a mirror. My hand trembled with both indignation and fear as I carefully brushed her cheek clean with my sleeve, terrified of damaging the artwork I had poured my soul into. The painting was far more than a simple memory. For me, it represented a piece of my fractured soul, a final, profound conversation with the woman I loved, perfectly preserved in oil and canvas, a connection no one could break. In the months following her passing, when eating and sleeping were nearly impossible due to the crushing loneliness, this portrait was how I learned to breathe again, my method of processing the overwhelming, suffocating grief of losing my anchor. Ben came downstairs moments later, pulling on work gloves, looking intensely uncomfortable under my silent scrutiny. He muttered, "It's just a painting, Malone. Calm down." The casual, searing cruelty of that single sentence brought a blinding wave of rage and tightness to my chest. Just a painting? Eleanor had been his wife's mother and his daughter's grandmother. I looked up at him, my voice dangerously low and steady. "Then you'll have no problem if I move it somewhere else, won't you?" I refused to engage in any further pointless argument with him. He had shown his moral capacity. Instead, I simply held his gaze, maintaining a tight, forced smile while an intense fury brewed beneath my outwardly calm, grandfatherly exterior. My daughter, Amy, appeared hesitantly at the top of the basement door, her face a mask of obvious discomfort, clearly understanding the tension but torn between her husband and her father. But she offered not a single word in my defense or Eleanor's. Her silence, in that moment, was a deeper, more profound wound than Ben's cruel words could ever reach. That night, I carefully carried the portrait back to the security of my bedroom, away from the dust and moisture. I leaned the canvas against the wall and sat across from it for hours in the engulfing darkness, contemplating my next steps. It felt powerfully as though Eleanor was watching me again, her painted eyes patient and full of the same enduring strength she had offered throughout my lifetime of personal failures, doubts, and middle-aged crises. In her radiant painted gaze, I found the forgiveness and renewed strength I needed for the difficult task ahead. The portrait showed her vibrant and alive, just before the illness truly took hold. That's when the concrete idea for my quiet, meticulous revenge began to form, not an angry retribution, but a potent, indelible lesson delivered straight from a wounded, fatherly heart, one designed for true, lasting effect. Ben and Amy had moved into the home Eleanor and I built after the birth of my beautiful granddaughter, Lila. I had offered my home without condition, eager to have them close, longing to hear the baby's cries and laughter, and desperately wanting to be an integral part of their new lives, filling the void Eleanor left. However, lately, Ben had engaged in relentless redecorating, systematically replacing my beloved, comfortable antiques with sleek, minimalist furniture and carelessly selling my older, meaningful paintings at garage sales, calling the entire process modernizing and streamlining. Every single change, driven by his need for control, was an attempt to push Eleanor's spirit further out of the house she had cherished for decades. The space felt increasingly less like the warm family home we built, and more like a transient, sterile hotel lobby, cold and impersonal. I had permitted these changes because I was so desperately missed having family surrounding me, and I craved the sound of a baby's joyful noise echoing through the halls. Now, I understood my fatal error. My desperation for connection had allowed his arrogance to assume complete, unchallenged control, eroding the very essence of the home, and that needed to change immediately before all trace of her was gone. At breakfast the following morning, I initiated the conversation casually, buttering my toast with deliberate slowness. I asked Ben if he planned to take down any more of my old stuff, now that the portrait was gone. He chuckled dismissively, glancing at his phone as if I were a nuisance. "Don't take it personally, Malone. We just want to make the place ours." The final phrase, "make it ours," landed like a sharp, insulting slap across my cheek, confirming his territorial mindset. This had been my home for 43 consecutive years, paid for with my sweat and Eleanor's love. Eleanor and I had raised our daughter here. We had meticulously chosen every single book on the shelf, every piece of furniture, and every decoration together over decades. Eleanor always used to say that a true home becomes sacred when profound love leaves its indelible fingerprints on the walls, and those fingerprints become history. Ben was actively trying to erase those fingerprints with a coat of sterile white paint, attempting to supplant our entire life story with his own blank, minimalist canvas. I decided then and there that I would leave one final, beautiful fingerprint, one that he would be forced to live with and remember forever, an action he could not easily undo. That same afternoon, I drove directly to the small, familiar stone church where Eleanor and I had exchanged our sacred vows 50 years earlier. The old pastor, Father Miller, immediately recognized me, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and spoke of Eleanor with immense fondness, recalling her consistent kindness and her dedicated volunteer work in the church office every single week for decades. I approached him with my heartfelt request: could I possibly hang a painting there, an artwork in her memory, to offer a permanent, visible honor to her generous spirit and enduring faith? He immediately smiled warmly and agreed to the idea without the slightest hesitation, suggesting a spot near the altar. I left the church feeling an exhilarating mix of excitement and deep anxiety, my heart pounding faster than it had in years as I anticipated the next steps of my secret plan. However, I knew I wouldn't hang the portrait just yet. I needed Ben to fully witness the dramatic, painful empty space his thoughtless action had created in my home first. He needed to understand the true weight of his actions, to feel the tangible, ongoing consequence of erasing someone so cherished from the communal memory. Amy planned a small, celebratory gathering for my granddaughter Lila's 5th birthday the following weekend, a standard family affair. The living room was flawlessly clean, thanks to Ben's obsessive nature, but it felt utterly sterile, like a cold, impersonal furniture showroom ready for inspection. Ben spent the afternoon proudly bragging about his new aesthetic to his friends, pointing out the soulless minimalist design he had created by purging all the character. I sat watching him from the couch, feeling like an outsider in my own house, noting how his guests only admired the sleek, meaningless prints on the wall. Not one person paused to remember Eleanor's famous warmth or asked about the vibrant portrait that had once dominated the space, telling its own story. The entire room had lost its unique soul, its rich history, and its foundational heart, replaced by fleeting trends. Children played in a beautiful but undeniably cold and unwelcoming space, lacking the cozy spirit Eleanor provided. That evening, after the last guest departed and the silence returned, I quietly and methodically took precise measurements of that vast, empty wall above the fireplace, carefully preparing for my next strategic, definitive move. The very next morning, armed with my plan and my measurements, I executed my plan's second phase. I replaced Ben's bland, modernist wall hanging with Eleanor's vibrant portrait again, using the newly gathered dimensions to ensure perfection. I hung it exactly where it belonged, perfectly centered, proudly dominant, and glowing beautifully under the sunlight that streamed through the large window, seemingly smiling down on the room. Amy entered the room moments later and gasped audibly, clutching her throat. She stood silently, her hand instinctively placed over her heart, tears immediately filling her eyes. She hadn't realized how deeply she had missed the sight of her mother's familiar, loving face until it had miraculously reappeared, restoring a piece of her grief. Ben arrived home that evening, his jaw instantly tightening with frustration and obvious anger. "We talked about this, Malone. This is unacceptable," he stated, his voice clipped and strained. I met his gaze, my own demeanor calm and serene. "We did. And I'm talking again, with her this time." The conversation never stopped. His face flushed a deep red, but I maintained my unshakable composure, refusing to engage in another fruitless, emotional argument. Dinner that night was thick with unbearable, unspoken tension that settled over the table like a suffocating blanket. Ben eventually broke the silence, delivering a flat ultimatum. Either the painting comes down immediately and permanently, or I must move it somewhere else entirely, meaning out of sight and out of mind. My daughter, Amy, looked tragically torn, her fork frozen midair. The internal conflict, her desire to support her husband battling her profound love for her deceased mother, was painfully etched across her face, showing her loyalty struggle. I offered a calm, non-committal nod, pretending to accede to his demand to move it. But inside, something essential broke, the last vestige of my hope that he would understand voluntarily, and a core of steel instantly hardened into fierce determination. I had spent 52 years of my life teaching high schoolers about the principles of art, truth, and genuine, lasting consequences. Ben, whether he realized it or not, was about to receive my final, most comprehensive lesson in humility. The next morning, before they awoke, I carefully wrapped the portrait in thick, protective blankets and packed it securely in the trunk of my car, ready to relocate her to a place where she would never be dismissed again. I drove directly to the old stone church again, my resolve solidified. The morning sunlight poured intensely through the beautiful stained glass, filling the sanctuary with the same vibrant, comforting colors that Eleanor's face used to reflect when she worked for hours in her own small painting studio. She had been a talented artist herself, before the demands of marriage and motherhood gradually consumed her available time and energy. Father Miller was ready and kindly helped me hang the portrait near the main altar, where the brilliant morning light illuminated her face perfectly. She looked radiant there, serene, almost as if she had already forgiven the entire world and was finally at profound peace in a place where she truly belonged. I stepped back and studied the canvas for a long moment, feeling her powerful, enduring presence surrounding me like a gentle hug. I told absolutely no one where I had taken the portrait. Not even Father Miller knew my exact motive. That meticulously guarded secret was an integral, non-negotiable part of the final, anticipated lesson for my son-in-law. Back at home, Ben immediately noticed the missing portrait when he walked through the front door, sweeping the room with a quick glance. He looked momentarily satisfied, visibly relieved that the supposed problem of her face was finally gone from the living room. However, when Amy asked me where I had moved it, I gave only an enigmatic, powerful answer. It's where she's loved again, somewhere her presence is honored. Ben's initial smirk quickly faded, replaced by a visible, creeping unease that settled across his shoulders like an unshakable weight of doubt. The sudden empty wall above the fireplace now stared back at him like a relentless, tangible accusation, a stark blank space that seemed to demand unsettling answers about his actions. The emotional impact of the loss, coupled with the ambiguity of its new, unknown location, was clearly taking a psychological toll. A few days later, something highly unexpected occurred. Ben, overcome by his unsettled conscience and profound curiosity, left the house to search for it himself. He needed to know where his rejection had led her. Ben's desperate search eventually led him to the church during a quiet, weekday community event, a place he rarely, if ever, frequented. He entered the sanctuary and immediately stopped, frozen in his tracks, when he saw the portrait hanging proudly and reverently above the altar. It was perfectly framed by the soft, flickering candlelight and the beautiful, heartfelt hymns being sung by the small, dedicated congregation. Eleanor seemed to literally glow in that sacred space, appearing utterly peaceful and eternal, a figure of spiritual significance. He stood staring at the canvas for a prolonged period, utterly motionless, his face etched with silent realization. He whispered something inaudible, perhaps an apology, before turning quickly and leaving without speaking to anyone. Later that night, Amy told me Ben hadn't uttered a single word all evening after returning home. He had come back thoughtful, quiet, and carrying a heavy, reflective expression that betrayed his inner struggle. The portrait was clearly working its silent, potent magic, forcing a confrontation with his guilt. But I knew that guilt was only the initial stage. I had one more profound, carefully planned move necessary to complete the lesson of respect. A week later, I quietly initiated the final, most public step. I donated a small, symbolic sum of money to the church in Eleanor's honored name, a gesture of gratitude. I specifically requested that a simple, elegant plaque be immediately placed beneath the portrait. It read, "To Eleanor Whitmore, the heart of this home and every home she touched." When Father Miller read the inscription aloud that Sunday during the service, emphasizing the powerful words, several parishioners wept openly, touched by the public tribute. Ben was present again, completely silent in the back pew, his eyes red and glistening with unshed tears. He stared intently at those deeply resonant words like they were written exclusively for him in a painfully familiar language he had long forgotten. The inscription, "The heart of this home," seemed to reach deep into his conscience, directly contradicting his actions. After the service, he approached me, his shoulders slumped, and asked to speak privately in the empty, silent sanctuary, signaling his surrender to his guilt. Ben's voice was low and rough with emotion as he admitted his underlying motivation. He had been trying, clumsily, to move on from the pain of loss by aggressively erasing all visual reminders of death and grief. He confessed that his own father had died suddenly when Ben was a young boy, and his emotionally distraught mother had immediately boxed up every single one of his father's possessions, burying the memory. Ben genuinely thought he was protecting Amy and Lila from experiencing that same devastating, permanent pain of memory. But seeing Eleanor so beautifully and publicly honored in the church sanctuary had forced him to realize he had unwittingly erased her profound love and positive impact as well. He said he felt overwhelmingly ashamed, as if he had taken something utterly sacred and heartlessly discarded it like basement trash. His voice cracked with genuine emotion as he spoke, finally opening up. I didn't offer any facile words. I simply nodded slowly, finally understanding the complex, wounded root of his defensive and arrogant behavior, acknowledging his pain without excusing his actions. That same night, Ben demonstrated a genuine change in behavior that caught me completely off guard. He walked into my study carrying a brand new frame, meticulously handcrafted from rich, polished oak, appearing strong, beautiful, and expensive. He explained that he wanted to replace the cheap frame he had carelessly broken while roughly moving the portrait to the basement. He presented it to me with a respectful bow of his head. "For her, a proper frame," he said simply. This There was an unmistakable sincerity in his voice. All defensive pretense was completely gone, replaced by a deep respect. I accepted the beautiful gift, but gently told him that the fundamental lesson wasn't quite finished yet. He needed to internalize the true gravity of his thoughtless actions on a deeper, more personal, and creative level. He had moved on from guilt to genuine remorse, but he needed a creative act of repentance to complete the circle. I invited Ben to my personal art studio that weekend, a dusty, paint-splattered sanctuary of creativity. We spent several hours together, quietly sketching from old, beloved photographs of Eleanor and Amy together, focusing on the past. His hands were visibly trembling as he tentatively held the brush, completely unfamiliar with the creative process but determined to try. "You can't truly paint someone you don't truly see," I told him gently, guiding his hand. For the first time, he really focused on the woman in the photos, not just my wife, but the loving grandmother his own daughter would never meet in person. He meticulously studied her kind expressions, the affectionate way she tilted her head, her familiar laugh lines, and the deep love radiating from her eyes. When he finished the meticulous replica, a beautiful, smaller piece, I asked him a crucial question. Would he hang this new painting himself in a prominent spot? We carefully carried the newly framed replica of the smaller painting back to the living room, ready for its new home. Ben climbed the small step ladder, gently hung the painting in its rightful, historic place above the fireplace, and stepped back to observe his work. The soft afternoon light streaming from the window fell perfectly across Eleanor's painted face once more, making her look incredibly soft and alive against the freshly painted wall. Amy entered the room and immediately covered her mouth, her eyes glistening with happy, relieved tears at the restoration of her mother's presence. She stood between her father and her husband, the fractured family feeling whole again, united by the painting. The entire room was immediately transformed, settling back into the comforting atmosphere of a true home, filled with warmth and history. But I still had one more surprise for them both, a final act of insurance. This deeply personal lesson needed a permanent, legal reminder that would transcend my lifetime. That night, I sat down at my desk and called my lawyer, who was well acquainted with my family's history. Years ago, I had made both Ben and Amy joint heirs to the property, a generous gesture of my trust, but now, I needed to add a crucial, non-negotiable clause to the official deed. It read, "The portrait above the fireplace must never be removed, sold, or replaced, or the entire inheritance immediately reverts to the Mercy Children's Charity." The piece of art was now legally established as a moral compass and a permanent, legal boundary, binding them to respect. I also made sure that my specific reasons for this amendment, the humiliation and removal of the portrait, were meticulously documented in the legal notes. The next day, I showed the official document to Ben without any further explanation, placing the responsibility squarely on his conscience and his signature. Ben took the legal document and read it slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the specific, binding terms twice, absorbing the weight of the restriction. He finally looked up at me, a profound seriousness in his eyes. "You really think I'd take it down again?" he asked, not defensively, but with genuine curiosity about my trust in him. I offered him a gentle, knowing smile. "I think grief fades, Ben, but respect shouldn't. This ensures you remember the lesson." He immediately signed the document without any protest or negotiation, appearing almost relieved by the finality of the legal commitment. The legal binding seemed to release a profound tension within him. Perhaps it meant he could stop fighting his own deeply buried conscience and finally move forward. Then, he asked me a question that warmed my heart, signaling a true shift. If I would consider teaching Lila to paint someday. His voice was softer, less defensive, and far more open and sincere than it had ever been before this difficult episode. I began teaching my granddaughter, Lila, to paint on quiet Sunday afternoons in the studio, a sacred ritual that Ben would often observe silently. She displayed her grandmother's calm patience and, surprisingly, her father's typically sharp, analytical eyes, now focused on color and form. One afternoon, she asked me a profound question that revealed her young understanding of loss. "Grandpa, why does Grandma smile, even in a picture?" I gave her an answer I truly believed, a lesson I had learned the hard way. "Because love doesn't need to breathe to live on, sweetheart. It stays right there in the paint." Ben overheard the exchange from the doorway, his back to us, and I watched discreetly as he quickly wiped a tear from his eye with the back of his hand. He stood watching his young daughter discover the joy of art, actively connecting with a loving grandmother she would never meet in person. That touching scene gave me one final, necessary idea to complete this powerful story of redemption, healing, and the integration of memory into their daily lives. I cleared a generous space in the backyard, near the old oak tree, and meticulously planted Eleanor's favorite flowers in raised beds. Lilies, cheerful daffodils, and bright pink and white peonies in all the vibrant colors she absolutely adored. Next to the beautiful, burgeoning garden, I installed a sturdy wooden bench and hung a smaller, weatherproof copy of her portrait under a protective glass case, her outdoor spot. This time, Ben insisted on helping me build the wooden frame and install the shrine. He carefully took the precise measurements, sanded the wood smooth with deep concentration, and treated it with a specialized protective finish, demonstrating his new respect for craftsmanship and memory. As we worked side by side, sharing tools and conversation, I realized he was no longer fighting his deep feelings. He was actively and genuinely honoring them through physical labor. I caught him staring at the new outdoor shrine one evening, completely lost in thoughtful contemplation, finding peace in the garden. He told me quietly, as we finished the protective roof over the outdoor portrait, that he had grown up in a house where death was always hidden and actively avoided. His surviving parent had refused to talk about his father after he passed away, creating a wall of silence. He repeated that he truly thought he was protecting Amy and Lila from that same intense, suffocating pain of forced remembrance. But now, he confessed, he finally understood that remembering is the only true way to heal. I told him Eleanor would have loved that answer. She always maintained that the bravest thing anyone could do was to remember someone completely and fully, flaws and all. Then, a moment occurred that dissolved all remaining tension between us, causing us all to cry together. The full, emotional breakthrough. During dinner the following evening, a quiet, peaceful affair, Lila innocently pointed to the main living room painting and stated clearly, "That's Grandma Ellie. Mommy says she watches over us." Amy immediately teared up, realizing her daughter had absorbed the lesson. Ben instinctively reached for her hand across the table, and the entire house finally felt whole again, the family unit restored. The silence that used to feel heavy and uncomfortable was now replaced by a genuine, profound peace. The kind of peace that comes from fully accepting loss as a part of life instead of desperately running from it. Ben looked at me across the table, his eyes earnest and clear, and asked if he could visit the church again, alone this time. I simply nodded, knowing he needed one final, private moment to close that painful chapter on his own terms and thank Eleanor for the difficult, life-changing lesson he had been forced to learn. A week later, Ben returned from the church, the original portrait carefully held in his hands. He explained that he had respectfully asked Father Miller if the painting could finally come home, explaining that Eleanor already lived eternally and fully in their hearts, not just in the church's memory. He climbed the ladder and hung the portrait himself, exactly in its rightful place above the fireplace, securing it tightly. He stepped back and whispered, almost to himself, "Welcome home." I looked at my son-in-law, his transformation complete, his arrogance gone, and simply said, "Lesson learned, my boy." Then we stood together, a reconciled family of 3 generations beneath Eleanor's gentle, painted smile. Finally, undeniably, a true home again, honoring the past while embracing the future. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, comment, and smash the subscribe button. Also check out other videos on the channel. Joe's got more interesting stories for you.